Well, hey, ladies and gentlemen, it's me, Jermaine, with another episode of The Simple Truth. This is a Simple Truth update, and I'm coming to you today, and I want to pose a few questions to you. First and foremost, a few years ago, 2008 to be exact, our president, then Senator Barack Hussein Obama, promised us that with his presidency, there would be change. Now, I have to recognize and I have to make sure that I share that prior to President Obama taking office, there were already financial problems in America. And he promised through his campaign that there will be changes made. Let me share with you some of the other promises of change. He said that everyone would have health care during his administration. Well, Obamacare has come about. But the question that I have is this. Are these the changes that we actually were looking for? Well, when it comes to the financial situation and the economy, this is something that has not changed. It has gotten worse, to be honest. Now, I know many political pundits will say that things have to get worse before they get better. Well, it seems as if we are on a downhill course, and nothing is going to change. It seems like it's going to get even worse, even more terrible than it is already. When it comes to Obamacare, we've discovered that there are things in the Obamacare that are going to cost the American people more than it's going to help. It's also worded in the Obamacare documentation that there's going to be a form of RFID chips that will be required. Is this the change that we actually wanted? Another one of the promises that was made by the then senator, the candidate, and eventually now the president of the United States, was that the atrocities that were going on at GITMO, Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, that these would subside, they would cease, that he was going to close GITMO. Well, in the latest news that has come across the wires, there are some upgrades that are being made to the communication system at Guantanamo Bay. Now, does that sound like a place that millions of dollars would be spent to improve the communications at GITMO, and then they would just walk away? And the torture situation. Well, to speak more on the torture situation, I have an interview from RT.com, which is the alternative news source, that will give you an idea of the things that are going on. Now, I know there will be many that will say, well, we need such a thing because of the fact that we have people out there that seek to do harm to America. Well, another change that was made that many people find themselves not as aware of or choose not to be aware of, which is the NDAA, the signing into law of the NDAA. Well, what is the NDAA if you're not familiar? It is the National Defense Authorization Act, which basically gives the federal government, the executive branch of the federal government, the ability to detain anyone who they feel is a threat. What definition is a threat? Someone speaking their mind? Freedom of speech has been taken away. My question to you, again, are these the changes that we really wanted to see? I want you to take a look at this report, and then I'll be back.
Doors of Guantanamo Bay. Mr. Sands, thanks for speaking to RT. So what torture techniques or interrogation techniques have actually been used at Guantanamo?
Well, it's pretty well established now what emerged. They adopted in the autumn of 2002 in the US Department of Defense a series of 18 techniques of interrogation arranged in 3 groups. And the first group was, shouting and screaming. The second group upped the ante, so to speak, and included sleep deprivation, the use of dogs to induce fear, And then category 3, the worst of all, included waterboarding and the use of water to induce misperceptions of suffocation. That document emerged after the Abu Ghraib images emerged, and I was interested to find out how a country which has turned its back against torture could have moved to adopt these techniques of interrogation. So I began, really in sort of 2005, to begin to look more closely through a series of interviews across the United States on what had happened. And what had been done by the administration was to spin a story which effectively said it started down at Guantanamo. There were a group of individuals down at Guantanamo, and it had then worked its way up the system. What I established was that that was not accurate. What had happened was that it had started at the top and had then worked its way down with significant pressure from the Pentagon, in particular, and people around the White House. So the tale was very different from the one which the administration had spun.
How easy was it to uncover that truth?
I began by knowing that I had to speak to people who had not previously spoken down at Guantanamo, and I focused on the lawyers. And so I began to approach a number of lawyers, and once I had found one lawyer who was willing to speak with me, who was a staff judge advocate down at Guantanamo, who was involved at the time back in 2002, once she had given me an account of what had happened, I could then go to the next person and say, well, publicly it says this, but I've now been told by this person who worked underneath you that this is in fact what happened. Would you care to comment on it? And the door could then begin to open.
But what are the implications of your findings? I mean, you argue in your book that some of these techniques equate to war crimes, is that right?
Well, I mean, I focused on the interrogation of one individual, a detainee number 63, alleged to be the 20th September the 11th hijacker, a man called Mohammed Al-Qahtani, Saudi national, and I focused in particular on what had happened to him in the period of November 2002 to January 2003, and I reached the conclusion without any real difficulty that he had been subject to techniques that amount to torture. Torture is an international crime, whether you call it a crime against humanity or a war crime. It's prohibited under international law. The United States is a party to an international convention that outlaws it. And the bottom line of it is, if you engage in torture as a state, you are responsible, and you are responsible to do a number of things. And one of the things you have to do is you have to investigate, and you have to investigate what happened. And that has never fully occurred. Even the administration of President Obama has, if you like, turned its back on the possibility of a proper investigation to ascertain who authorized what, when, precisely. It wasn't a few bad eggs. It was people right up at the top. And in fact,
namely,
well, President Bush ultimately said he signed off on waterboarding, and that happened in the summer of 2002. We now know it's pretty well established by a group of individuals with the president at the top. Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice was involved in the process, and various lawyers in the National Security Council and in the Department of Justice who signed off on waterboarding, or approved waterboarding, gave their support to waterboarding, and that to me was shocking. So what I wanted to know was how could, in particular, lawyers who'd been to the finest law schools in the world, to Harvard, to Duke, Georgetown, I mean, terrific law schools, how had they got themselves into a state that they were willing to sign off on techniques that amounted to torture?
And what was their answer?
I think there was a sense of intense pressure, that the United States was under an unparalleled threat. I don't think that's a justification or an excuse or a reason, but there was a tremendous sense of pressure, coupled with the fact that a number of the lawyers involved at very senior levels had no real background in the subject of international law or the protection of the rights of the individual, and were very ideological in their approach. Basically, they saw their function as lawyers not as being to give independent legal advice, but to give the president the tools to do what he wanted to do. That's not the function of a lawyer in any society, in any democratic society.
But surely waterboarding rings alarm bells with any lawyer.
It should have rung alarm bells, and it did ring alarm bells in many parts. What I established was that two of the major sort of organs of government in the United States were cut out of the process. the military, the upper echelons of the military, were cut out of the process by Donald Rumsfeld's General Counsel Jim Haynes, and the State Department was cut out of the process. And the lawyers at the State Department and the lawyers in the Department of Defense, the military lawyers, the career military lawyers, know better than anyone that it's in the United States' interest not to engage in this kind of activity. So they were cut out of the process, and instead you got a group of ideologues brought in to give the president the tools to do what he wanted to do, irrespective of whether there was a reasonable argument that it was lawful or not.
Which individual moment that you investigated would you say shocked you most?
When I was speaking with the folks who were down at Guantanamo, I discovered, and my book actually broke the story, that one of the influences in the autumn of 2002 was a television program called 24, which is a TV program about the use of torture, which promotes the idea really that torture works, it produces results, it's a sensible way to proceed. And one of the people that I interviewed, Diane Beaver, confirmed to me, actually unexpectedly, because I hadn't really asked the question, she just said that 24 was a big influence, and it created an environment. And so you began to see there the connection between, popular cultural TV programs and what people do. That was shocking.
So is there any chance those responsible for what went on at Guantanamo Bay will actually be held to account?
There's already some degree of accountability. I mean, there's a group who are known as the Bush Six, the six main lawyers at the top of the Bush administration. The former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, the former Department of Defense lawyer Jim Haynes, some of the Department of Justice lawyers, John Yoo, Jay Bybee. It's very difficult for them to set foot outside the United States now. There's every possibility that they could be subject to questioning if they were to set foot outside the United States. So there's some degree of accountability. But my position is this is a breach of law. This is potentially crime, and you need a criminal investigation. And that has not happened, and there's no indication that it will happen.
What about former President Bush? Is there a chance he can actually be charged with war crimes?
I mean, President Bush has rather brazenly given a series of interviews in which, he says waterboarding is right. If I had to do it, I'd do it again. Dick Cheney said the same thing and has taken responsibility for it. And that's had certain consequences in the sense that some of his international travel has been limited. He was due to go last year to Switzerland. That didn't happen. It is said because there were questions. There have been big protests when he's gone to Canada. Who knows what will happen over time? One of the things that I was involved with many years ago was the case of Pinochet. That was, of course, at a different time, at a different scale, but it took 25 years for the wheels of justice to sort of creak into motion. And one day, visiting London, he was arrested. And so these things take time. You don't know when these things are going to produce results or what's going to happen. And, the question of responsibility hangs in the ether.
Okay, now that you've heard the report, I pose this last question to you, and it's a question that I've posed throughout this video. The changes that have been made, the changes that we have seen, are these the changes that we actually wanted? Are they changes that benefit and make this a better place to live? Or are we more and more seeing that it is the place of government control? The simple truth of it is, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that really nothing has changed. It's gotten worse, more bleak. Our financial situation is in disarray. Our standing around the world is that of nobody wants to have anything to do with us. We are continuing to keep GITMO, Guantanamo Bay, open. And in my opinion, GITMO is more of a test case of what will happen when the detainments begin via the NDAA. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for you to wake up. And I want you to remember, and as I always say, the simple things are oftentimes the most profound, but yet they're the most difficult to put into action and to actually do. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll be back with you real soon.